The polished black barrel of the Glock gleamed under the intense afternoon sun, steady and unyielding, pointed directly at the center of her chest. "On your knees," Officer Nathaniel Coulson growled, his voice a low, pure roar of unfiltered power. Dr. Avery Taylor, hands raised in surrender, did not flinch. The crisp white silk of her blouse stood in sharp contrast against the rough asphalt she was being forced onto. He did not see an unarmed citizen complying with an illegal order. He saw a target for his contempt, an opportunity to assert his dominance. As she slowly lowered herself, the rough ground scraping against her knees, his smile widened into a cruel expression of satisfaction. I had no idea. He was not pointing his weapon at a woman he had racially profiled. He was threatening the very federal investigator who would dismantle his entire world. Before we continue, comment below where you're watching from and subscribe, because the road to justice in this story is unmissable. The day had been perfect, flawless, like the sky stretching over the immaculate suburbs, the kind of afternoon that felt like a reward in itself. The engine of Avery Taylor's McLaren 720S purred, a low, satisfied roar that vibrated through the carbon fiber chassis and up her spine. It was a symphony of precision engineering, a machine she had earned through a decade of relentless work navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Department of Justice. Driving it was not about ostentation. It was about appreciating the culmination of design and power, a moment of kinetic meditation on the open road. She was heading home after a regional briefing. With the windows down, the warm air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming hydrangeas. For one fleeting instant, she was simply a woman enjoying a beautiful drive. The weight of her federal badge and the cases that haunted her at night felt like a distant memory. That moment shattered when the blinding red and blue strobe lights filled her rearview mirror. They appeared from nowhere, a predator emerging from suburban camouflage. Avery's heart did not leap with the panic of a lawbreaker. It sank with the weary resignation of a black woman in an expensive car. She immediately checked the speedometer. She was well under the limit. Her plates and insurance were perfect. Her record was spotless. She knew this was not a traffic stop. She signaled and brought the supercar to a smooth stop on the shoulder of the wide, tree-lined street. She killed the engine. Its magnificent purr faded, replaced by the aggressive, rhythmic chirp of the approaching siren, which finally fell silent as the patrol car screeched to a halt behind her. Avery placed her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, a practiced gesture of non-aggression. She watched in the mirror as the officer climbed out. He was a heavy-set man, his solid frame strained under the dark blue uniform, a slight paunch pressing against his duty belt. His movements were slow, deliberate, carrying an arrogance that betrayed an excess of authority and a deficit of everything else. Mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, turning him into an impersonal instrument of intimidation. He did not approach the window. Instead, he stopped near the rear of the car, one hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered weapon. The minutes stretched, a calculated tactic meant to fray nerves and establish dominance. Avery waited, her composure a silent act of defiance. Finally, he advanced slowly, boots crunching on the gravel. He peered through the passenger window, his gaze sweeping over the custom leather interior, before settling on her. Well, what do we have here?" His voice was a lazy drawl, soaked in condescension. "License, registration, proof of insurance." I did not say ma'am, of course. "Officer," Avery said in a serene, respectful tone. She kept her hands visible as she slowly opened the glove box. "The documents are right here." "Slowly," he ordered, moving his hand from his hip to the gun. "I don't want any surprises." The implication was as clear as it was offensive. She passed the documents through the window. He barely glanced at them, his attention fixed on her. "This car is a hell of a ride for a girl like you," he said, the deliberate pause loaded with meaning. "Must have cost a fortune. Where does someone like you get that kind of money?" "I'm a doctor," Avery answered, offering a simplified, pleasant version of her profession. Lawyer, investigator, federal agent. Those titles would only increase his aggression. He let out a short, mocking laugh. "A doctor, huh? What kind of doctor?" "That has nothing to do with this stop, officer," she said calmly, but with a new edge. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" The shift was instantaneous. Her challenge, subtle as it was, had undermined his fragile authority. The lazy condescension vanished, replaced by raw hostility. "You know what? I don't like your attitude," he growled. "Get out of the car." "Why?" Avery asked, her mind already cataloging the violations. This was an illegal order. The stop was a pretext, and now he was escalating without cause. "I said get the hell out of the damn car, now!" he roared, unsnapping the holster. Knowing that resistance would become justification for violence, Avery obeyed. She opened the door and stood to her full height, serene and radiating a quiet confidence that seemed to enrage him further. The afternoon sun warmed her skin, but a chill ran down her spine. The white silk of her blouse felt thin, vulnerable. "Turn around, hands behind your back," he ordered. He did not handcuff her. Instead, he patted her down roughly, his hands moving with an intent meant to be both inspection and insult. He found nothing. No weapons, no contraband. Only the firm, athletic frame of a woman who ran every morning. This seemed to enrage him even more. The absence of any irregularity was an affront to his predetermined narrative. His frustration boiled over. "I think you're hiding something," he declared, raising his voice, "and I'm going to find it." That was when he drew his weapon. The click of the Glock clearing the holster was deafening in the quiet suburban air. He raised it. The polished black barrel, a stark, terrifying circle, pointed directly at her heart. A minivan slowing past them had its occupants pale with shock before speeding away, unwilling to get involved. "On your knees," Officer Coulson growled. The name she had read on his badge now burned into her memory. "I want to see you on your knees now." Her training demanded that she analyze, de-escalate, control the situation. But her humanity recoiled at the brutal degradation of the command. He was not ensuring her safety. He was savoring her humiliation. With her hands still raised, Avery's mind became a fortress. She isolated the fear and the fury, transforming them into cold, hard data. Officer Nathaniel Coulson. Badge number 70034. Illegal stop. Illegal order to exit the vehicle. Unjustified display of a firearm. Coercion under color of law. He was building his own case, one violation at a time. She held his gaze, hidden behind the mirrored lenses, and with a determination that felt forged in steel, she slowly and deliberately lowered herself to the ground. The sharp gravel of the roadside dug into her knees through the thin fabric of her pants. The world narrowed to the black hole of his gun barrel and the cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. The asphalt was rough and hot beneath her knees, a bed of sharp stones designed to punish. Every small point of pressure was a new insult, a physical manifestation of the power officer. Coulson wielded with such delight. He kept the Glock trained on her while he began searching the McLaren, a clumsy, brutal inspection that was less a search and more a violation. He yanked open the glove box she had just closed, scattering her immaculate documents. He shoved his hands under the seats, grunting with effort. He opened the front trunk, the frunk, and slammed it shut in frustration when he found only a small leather briefcase. Avery remained completely still, upright, hands still raised. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her bow her head. Her gaze stayed fixed forward, her breathing slow and steady. Inside, however, her mind was a controlled storm. She was compartmentalizing. One part of her brain was the victim, feeling the sting of humiliation and the cold fear that any sudden movement could be her last. But the dominant part, the federal investigator, was tracking the clock. She noted the time on her watch. She memorized the patrol car's plate. She observed his movements, the lack of any professional search protocol, the open contempt in his actions. I was not looking for a weapon. He was looking for a reason, any reason, to justify his intolerance. He found nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no bags of money. The immaculate interior of her car revealed no secrets, only the quiet evidence of a successful, organized life. The briefcase in the frunk contained her laptop and the sealed files from the briefing. Government property. He lacked the authority or the intelligence to press that issue. His shoulders slumped slightly. His aggressive posture deflated with disappointment. The big arrest he had imagined, the one that would justify his profiling, had evaporated under the afternoon sun. He returned to her with heavy steps, his face a mask of bitter resentment. "Looks like you're clean," he spat, as if her innocence were a personal insult. This time, he holstered his weapon with a loud, aggressive snap. The immediate threat receded, but its echoes still hung in the air. Get up, Get out of here." He did not offer a hand. He did not apologize. He simply turned his back and strutted back to his patrol car, his authority reasserted, his cruelty satisfied. Avery rose slowly and gracefully. Her knees screamed in protest, and she felt the sharp sting where the gravel had broken the skin. She brushed the dust and pebbles from her pants with deliberate, measured movements. She looked down at her white silk blouse. A small smudge of dirt stained the otherwise perfect fabric where she had braced herself. It was a tiny mark, but it felt like a brand. She refused to look at him as he sat in his car, probably writing a ticket for a non-existent violation to justify the stop. She walked to her car, opened the door, and sat back in the driver's seat. The soft leather felt like a sanctuary after the harshness of the asphalt. She did not start the engine immediately. She sat for a full minute with her hands on the wheel, staring at the road. She watched his car pull away and speed down the street, disappearing around a curve. He was gone, but the residue of his presence, a toxic film of hatred and injustice, still hung in the air. She took a deep, shuddering breath, then another and another, to contain the adrenaline and transform the lingering tremor in her hands into focused energy. The victim was now completely silenced. The investigator was in control. She did not drive home. She drove 2 blocks, turned down a quiet side street, and parked in the shade of a large oak. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small encrypted satellite phone, a device reserved for senior Department of Justice personnel for confidential communications. She bypassed local networks, ensuring the call could not be traced or monitored by any local agency. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once. "Sterling," a calm, authoritative voice answered. "David, it's Avery," she said in a voice that was a perfect reflection of professional composure. There was no tremor, no trace of the trauma she had just endured. "I have a problem. Code 7. There was a brief pause on the other end. The only hint of Director David Sterling's surprise a Code 7 was uncommon. It meant a Department of Justice agent had been the direct victim of a serious crime or major misconduct while in the field. It was the signal that triggered an immediate, massive federal response. "Go ahead, Avery. Are you safe?" "Affirmative," she said. "Earlier today, Officer Nathaniel Coulson, badge number 734 of the Northwood Police Department, stopped me under pretext. He ordered me out of my vehicle illegally, searched me illegally, and held me at gunpoint without cause. He forced me to kneel on the asphalt while he illegally searched my vehicle." She recounted the facts with the objective precision of an after-action report, listing every violation, every threat, every detail of the encounter. She did not speak of humiliation or fear. She spoke of laws broken and rights violated. The silence on the other end was dense. David Sterling, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, was processing the indignity inflicted on one of his best investigators. When he finally spoke, his voice was ice. "I'm very sorry this happened to you, Avery. Are you uninjured?" "Scraped knees, bruised dignity. I'll survive," she answered, allowing a glimpse of her true self. But David, he enjoyed it. This wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. "I understand," Sterling said, his voice now stripped of all warmth, replaced by the cold fury of a man about to unleash a storm. "Your testimony is the primary evidence. We are opening a federal civil rights investigation against Officer Nathaniel Coulson and the Northwood Police Department, effective immediately. Do not speak to any local authority. Do not answer any of their questions. From this moment, you are a federal witness. An initial response team from the regional FBI office is being dispatched to your location. Send me your coordinates. They will escort you home. We've got this, Avery. The full weight of this department is behind us." She ended the call and sent her location, leaning her head back against the leather headrest. Avery closed her eyes. The mask of serenity remained intact, but beneath it, a small sense of relief appeared. Everything was in motion. It was no longer just her pain, her humiliation. It was a federal case, and she knew with absolute bone-deep certainty that she would be the one to see it through to the end. Officer Nathaniel Coulson sat in the break room of the Northwood Police Department drinking lukewarm coffee. The adrenaline from the stop had long since faded, replaced by a familiar, simmering resentment. The woman in the luxury car had been clean. That irritated him. In his worldview, people like her, black, successful, and self-assured, were always hiding something. Her composure, her refusal to be intimidated, had felt like a personal attack on his authority. He needed to reframe the story in his mind, and especially on paper. He logged into his patrol car terminal and began writing the incident report. The blank screen was a canvas for his fiction. With every keystroke, he distorted the reality of the encounter into a version that cast him as the hero and Avery Taylor as the villain. He wrote that he had seen her McLaren weaving in its lane, a clear sign of a possible impaired driver. Lie number 1. He claimed that when he initiated the stop, the driver, Avery Taylor, was immediately hostile and aggressive, using language full of contempt for law enforcement. Lie number 2. He detailed how she refused his initial legitimate orders to produce her documents, forcing him to ask repeatedly. Lie number 3. The centerpiece of his invention was the moment he ordered her out of the car. He wrote that she made a furtive movement toward the center console, causing him to believe she was reaching for a weapon. This, he wrote with justification, was the reason he drew his service weapon. Her kneeling, he claimed, was not the result of his order, but a dramatic, voluntary gesture on her part while she continued screaming obscenities at him. He described a deranged, dangerous woman, a credible threat to officer safety. He concluded the report by stating that out of pure professional courtesy, he had released her with a warning, despite her aggressive behavior. He signed the report, sealing his version of events into the official department records. He felt relief. It was his word against hers. And in this world, he knew whose word carried more weight. His satisfaction was short-lived. An hour later, his sergeant called him into the office. The chief was on the phone, his voice metallic and tense over the speaker. "Coulson, what the hell did you do? We just got a call from the regional director of the Department of Justice. They're opening a civil rights investigation on you, personally." Coulson's blood ran cold. The Department of Justice, not Internal Affairs, not some local oversight committee. The feds. "She must have called someone," he stammered, and his carefully constructed narrative suddenly felt flimsy. "She was lying, Chief. A real piece of work. Threatened me. Said she had connections." "Save it," the chief snapped. "Your union rep is on the way. Don't say another word to anyone until you talk to him." The union representative, an aggressive, bulldog-faced man named Stan Henderson, arrived 20 minutes later. He clapped Coulson on the shoulder with a conspiratorial smile. "Don't worry about a thing, Mark," Henderson said in a rough baritone. "These big shots from the Department of Justice come down here thinking they can run the show, but they don't know how we do things. We protect our own." They sat in a small, windowless office while Henderson read Coulson's report. He nodded with approval. "Good. This is solid. Furtive movement. Non-compliant. Belligerent. That's the trifecta. Your word against the official report of a decorated officer. Who do you think they're going to believe?" "But it's the Department of Justice," Coulson said, the confidence Henderson had just given him already wavering. "We're not dealing with some public defender, and she's a rich woman with a supercar who probably thinks she's above the law," Henderson shot back, his voice thick with the same class resentment Coulson himself felt. "We'll paint her as an arrogant elitist with a grudge against the police. We'll leak it to the press. We'll file a countersuit for harassment. We'll drown her in process and paperwork until she wishes she'd never seen a Northwood cop." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "The blue wall is real, Mark. And these federal agents are about to run straight into it. We'll get out ahead of this. I'll make some calls. We'll frame it as an attack, not just on you, but on every officer in this department. An attack on law and order." Henderson's words were a balm to Coulson's nerves. He felt his swagger returning. He was not alone. The entire machinery of the department, driven by the union, was gearing up to protect him. He was part of a brotherhood, a fortress. They would lie for him, cover for him, and attack anyone who dared to question him. The fabricated report was no longer just his story. It was the official truth of the department. As he left the meeting, Coulson felt a renewed sense of invincibility. Let the feds come. He had the full support of the Northwood Police Department. The wall would hold. It always had. I had no idea that the woman he had forced to her knees was not merely a federal agent. She was an expert in demolition, and she was coming for the foundations. 2 days after the incident, Avery received the call she had expected. It was from the Internal Affairs Division of the Northwood Police Department. A Detective Miller and a Detective Shaw requested that she give a formal statement. Her Department of Justice Director, David Sterling, had already advised her on the protocol. The federal investigation took precedence over any local inquiry, but refusing to cooperate with IAA, no matter how corrupt, could be interpreted as obstruction. The official directive was to go, answer their questions truthfully, but with the understanding that the process was likely a formality designed to fail. Avery arrived at the station escorted by 2 FBI agents from the response team. Their plain appearance was a subtle but unmistakable message. She was under federal protection. The Northwood Station was a utilitarian, drab building that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. The IA detectives, a pair of middle-aged, disheveled men with expressions of profound boredom, led her into a small, sterile interrogation room. One table, 3 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner. It was a stage set for an interrogation, not an investigation. "Dr. Taylor," Detective Miller began in a tone that attempted professional neutrality and failed completely. "We're just here to get your version of events. Could you walk us through what happened that afternoon?" Avery recounted the incident with the same dispassionate precision she had used with Director Sterling. She detailed the pretext stop, Coulson's aggressive questioning, the illegal order to exit her vehicle, and the moment he drew his weapon and forced her to kneel. She spoke calmly, presenting the facts without emotional embellishment. The detectives listened, pens scratching in their notebooks, but their eyes were distant. When she finished, the real purpose of the interview began. "So you were driving a McLaren," Detective Shaw said, looking up from his notes. "That's a very fast car. Are you sure you weren't exceeding the speed limit, even a little?" "I'm sure," Avery answered. "I was well under the limit." "Officer Coulson's report indicates you were weaving in your lane," Miller interjected. "He suspected you might be under the influence. Had you had anything to drink that day?" "No," she said firmly, "and I was not weaving." The questions continued in that vein, each one designed not to uncover the truth, but to undermine her credibility and align with Coulson's fabricated report. They were looking for any inconsistency, any admission they could twist. "Officer Coulson also noted that you became very agitated," Shaw said, choosing his words carefully. "He described you as hostile. Is that how you would characterize your behavior?" "I would characterize my behavior as compliant, but unwilling to be intimidated," Avery corrected. "I answered his questions until they became irrelevant to a lawful traffic stop. I asserted my rights calmly." "So you argued with the officer?" Miller pressed. "I questioned the legality of his orders, which is my right as a citizen," she stated. The atmosphere in the room thickened with unspoken animosity. They were not investigating a fellow officer, they were interrogating an accuser. The most revealing moment of the interview came when she described being forced to her knees at gunpoint. Detective Shaw leaned back in his chair with a slight, cynical smile. "It's a very stressful job, Dr. Taylor. Officers have to make split-second decisions to ensure their safety. Officer Coulson's report mentions that you made a sudden, furtive movement inside your vehicle. Can you speak to that?" Avery looked him directly in the eyes without blinking. "There was no furtive movement. I was retrieving my documents from the glove box I'd instructed." His decision to draw his weapon was not about safety. It was an act of aggression and intimidation. The two detectives exchanged a fleeting, almost imperceptible glance that conveyed a shared conclusion. They had already made up their minds. This woman was, as the union representative had likely framed her, an arrogant troublemaker who did not respect the badge. The interview concluded a few minutes later. "Thank you for your cooperation, Dr. Taylor. We'll be in touch," Miller said with the empty procedural politeness. Someone who had already decided the outcome. As she left the interrogation room, escorted by her FBI detail, Avery knew with absolute certainty what the result of the IA investigation would be. They would find that Officer Coulson had acted in accordance with department guidelines. They would deem his use of force justified based on his perception of a threat. They would label her complaint unfounded. The entire process was a farce, a carefully choreographed dance of plausible deniability designed to protect the institution from accountability. It was a well-oiled machine for exonerating its own. As she stepped out of the station into the clean outdoor air, Avery felt a renewed sense of purpose. Internal affairs was not a path to justice. It was part of the disease, and it confirmed what she and David Sterling already knew. To cure it, they would need to bring a power that the Northwood Police Department could neither control, manipulate, nor ignore. The illusion of local oversight had evaporated. Now the real investigation could begin. Sergeant Harlan Miller, no relation to the IA detective, was a completely different kind of officer. He was a relic of another era, a man who still believed the badge should mean something more than tribal loyalty. He had spent decades in the Northwood Police Department watching as corruption and favoritism slowly, insidiously, ate away at the department's core. He had seen good officers pushed out, and bullies like Nathaniel Coulson protected and promoted. He was close to retirement, trying to keep a low profile and an intact pension, but his conscience was a heavy weight. Harlan was the supervising sergeant for the patrol shift, and Coulson's incident report had landed on his desk for review. He read it, and a familiar bitter taste filled his mouth. Furtive movement. Belligerent. Non-compliant. It was a textbook fabrication, a script he had seen used a dozen times to justify a bad stop or an act of unnecessary violence. He knew Coulson. He knew the man had a temper and a particular resentment toward people of color, especially those who refused to act deferential. Later that day, he overheard Henderson, the union representative, bragging in the hallway. "We shut that federal case down. I'm already clearing Coulson. She'll be lucky if we don't sue her for filing a false complaint." The casual, petulant cruelty turned Harlan's stomach. He thought about the woman in the report, Dr. Avery Taylor. He had seen her name on the initial Department of Justice inquiry letter. A federal agent. They had done this to a federal agent, and they were preparing to walk away with lies, with the full backing of the department. The moral weight of his silence became unbearable. For years he had told himself that speaking up was professional suicide, that one man could not change a corrupt system. He had a family, a mortgage. But watching this unfold, watching the department close ranks around a bully like Coulson to discredit a victim who held federal authority, felt like a point of no return. This was not a simple citizen complaint that could be easily dismissed. This was the United States Department of Justice. If the department was willing to lie outright in the face of a federal investigation, then it was truly beyond saving from within. For 2 days, Harlan wrestled with his decision. He went home and looked at the photo of his own daughter, a young woman only a few years younger than Dr. Taylor, and felt a deep shame. What kind of world was he leaving her if he allowed men like Coulson to act with impunity, protected by a wall of lies that he himself was part of? On the third night, he made his decision. Using a disposable phone he kept for emergencies, he found a secure contact number for the Regional Department of Justice office. He knew this call could end his career and potentially put him and his family at risk. The blue wall was not just a code of silence. It was a pact, and breaking it was the ultimate betrayal. But the alternative, living with the certainty that he had stood by and done nothing, was worse. He stepped into his backyard. The night air was cool and still. He dialed the number with his heart pounding. "A professional," no-nonsense voice answered. "Civil Rights Division. I need to speak with the lead investigator on the Northwood police case," Harlan said in a low, slightly roughened voice. "The one involving Avery Taylor." "Who is calling, please?" "That doesn't matter," Harlan said. "What matters is that I have information. Information that proves the department is covering for Officer Coulson. Information that proves this is not the first time he's done something like this." There was a pause on the line as the agent processed the gravity of the call. This was the opening they had been waiting for. "Where can we meet?" "There's an old roadside diner at the crossroads," Harlan said, naming a place well outside of town, a forgotten relic where no cop would be caught dead. "Tomorrow at noon, I'll be at a corner table. Tell them to come alone." He hung up before they could ask more questions. Standing in the darkness of his backyard, Harlan Miller felt a terror he had not experienced since his rookie days. But it was mixed with something else, a flicker of relief. He had spent a lifetime behind the blue wall, reinforcing it with his silence. Now he was about to hand someone the sledgehammer to bring it down. He did not know if he could trust Dr. Taylor, but he knew with absolute certainty that he could not trust his own department. It was a desperate gamble, a voice from the shadows rising, hoping that this time someone was listening. The Crossroads Diner was a study in faded glory. The chrome was pitted, the red vinyl of the booths cracked, and the air smelled of stale coffee and old grease. It was the perfect place to be invisible. Avery entered alone, exactly as the caller had instructed. She wore jeans and a simple gray hoodie. Her usual tailored power suits had been replaced by an outfit designed to blend in. Her gaze swept the room, and she identified him immediately. A man in his later years, with a weary expression and a face marked by the deep lines that come from decades of stress. He sat in the back corner, nursing a coffee. He looked like 1,000 exhausted public servants she had seen in her career. She sat in the booth across from him. "I'm Avery Taylor." He did not give his name. He only nodded, studying her, searching for something. "You don't look like you're here to play games," he said finally, his voice rough. "I'm not," she confirmed. "You said you had information." He glanced around the empty diner, then reached down and lifted a worn accordion-style folder onto the table. It was thick, packed with papers. He slid it across to her. "I've been a cop for decades," he said, a deep bitterness in his voice. "I've seen a lot. I swallowed almost all of it. I stayed quiet. But Coulson is different. He's not just a bad cop. He's a predator who uses the badge as a shield." Avery looked at the file, then at him. "What is this?" "It's Coulson's real file," the sergeant said. "The one Internal Affairs doesn't have. The one the Union makes sure never sees the light of day." He leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. Every time a complaint against him was about to stick, it got buried. The report disappeared. The witness recanted. "I started making copies at first, just to cover myself. Then it became a habit, a record of the disease." Avery opened the folder. These were not just copies of official reports. It was an unofficial chronicle of one man's reign of terror. The first file was a complaint from years earlier. A young Latino man stopped for a broken taillight, then beaten during the arrest for resisting. The charges against the man were eventually dropped, and his complaint against Coulson was dismissed as unfounded. Attached to the report was a small, grainy photograph of the man's bruised face, a picture Frank had taken himself. She kept reading. Page after page detailed a chilling pattern of behavior almost identical to her own experience, but often with far more violent consequences. There was a black teenager accused of loitering who ended up with a broken arm. A woman who called about a domestic dispute only to be harassed and intimidated by Coulson himself. An elderly man verbally abused and illegally detained after questioning a parking ticket. In every case, the official file had been sanitized. Coulson was cleared. The victims were ignored or discredited. But Frank's hidden file contained the evidence the department had buried, handwritten notes from witnesses who were later pressured into silence, copies of initial medical reports that contradicted the claim of no injuries in the official files, even a transcript of a dispatch recording that had been officially erased due to a technical failure, in which Coulson could be heard using racial slurs before initiating a stop. "Why me? Why now?" Avery asked quietly, her eyes still moving over the incriminating documents. "Because you're different," he said. "You have a power they can't ignore. They can bury the complaint of a kid from the projects. They can intimidate a working-class mother. But they can't make the Department of Justice disappear. I watched them build their wall of lies around you, just like always. I realized that if you couldn't get past it, no one could. He took a final sip of his coffee. I'm 2 years from retirement. This, he pointed at the file, this will destroy me if it ever comes back to me. My name can never be associated with this. You have my word, Avery said, looking him in the eyes. She understood the gravity of his sacrifice. He was entrusting her with the work of a lifetime, a secret he had kept for years, and his own survival depended on her discretion. You will be protected. Your information will be treated as coming from a confidential, anonymous source. He nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. His real sickness is power, Frank said, his voice full of disgust. He likes making people feel small, especially people he considers beneath him. What he did to you, forcing you to your knees, is his personal signature. He's done it before. There's a statement from a kid from a few years back. Same thing. Gun to the head. Forced to kneel on the sidewalk for a traffic stop. Avery felt a cold fury wash over her. Her own humiliation had not been an isolated act of cruelty. It was part of a deep, pathological pattern. This file was no longer just about her case. It was about every person whose life Coulson had damaged, every voice the department had silenced. She closed the folder. Its weight was far greater than the sum of its pages. It was the key. It was the blueprint of Coulson's history and the department's corruption. Thank you, Sergeant, she said, finally acknowledging the rank she knew he held. You have no idea what you've just done. I hope I did the right thing, he said, rising from the booth. He left a few dollars on the table for the coffee and walked out of the diner without looking back, disappearing into the shadows from which he had come. Avery remained seated a moment longer, with the ledger of injustice on the table in front of her. The game had just changed. She no longer had only a case. She had a crusade. The drive back to the regional FBI office, where the Department of Justice had established a temporary command post, was the longest of her life. The accordion folder sat on the passenger seat, a silent, damning passenger. It felt radioactive, a dense concentration of corruption capable of bringing down an entire institution. She no longer had evidence of only one officer's misconduct. She had evidence of a systematic cover-up, a conspiracy of silence that reached into the highest levels of the Northwood Police Department. She entered the sterile conference room, where Director David Sterling was waiting via secure video link from Washington. His face, projected on a large screen, was grim. The initial phase of their investigation had already slammed into the blue wall. Henderson had promised. Every records request had been met with delays, procedural obstacles, and outright obstruction. They're playing games, Avery, Sterling said, his voice tight with frustration. They sent Coulson's file. It's so clean you could eat off it. Not a single sustained complaint in 15 years. It's fiction. That's because this is his real file, Avery said, placing the folder on the conference table. She opened it and began laying the documents out one by one for the high-resolution camera focused on the table. She presented the hidden complaints, the witness statements, the photographs of bruised victims, and the transcript of the erased dispatch call. She explained the source, a high-level confidential informant, inside the Northwood Police Department, a man who had risked everything to bring this to light. As she detailed the contents of the hidden file, the atmosphere in the room, both in the field office and thousands of miles away in Washington, shifted from frustration to a cold, predatory focus. The scope of their mission had multiplied tenfold. This was no longer about one rotten apple. It was about a poisoned orchard. Sterling was silent for a full minute after she finished, his eyes fixed on the evidence displayed on the screen. The gears of federal power turned in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and resonant with the full authority of his office. This changes everything. We are no longer investigating Officer Coulson for a single incident. We are opening a full pattern or practice investigation into the Northwood Police Department for systemic civil rights violations. The words hung in the air, momentous and irreversible. A pattern or practice investigation was the Department of Justice's nuclear option, a top-down inquiry into the culture and operational structure of a law enforcement agency. It meant federal investigators would have the authority to subpoena years of records, interview every officer, and examine every policy. It was a declaration of war against the department's corruption. "Avery, you will lead the field team," Sterling ordered. "This started with you, and you will see it through. Assemble your team. I want the best civil rights attorneys, the most tenacious FBI investigators, and the forensic accountants who can follow the money on these settlement payouts. I am authorizing full operational funding effective immediately." The federal giant that had been tentatively knocking on Northwood's door was now preparing to kick it down. Sterling's directives were rapid and decisive. The confidential informant must be protected at all costs. All information from that file must be safeguarded. They would use it to guide their investigation and know what evidence to demand, but they would independently verify everything. They would build their own case piece by piece, so the source would never be compromised. "Continue," he said. "The first wave of subpoenas goes out tomorrow morning. We will demand every complaint ever filed against Coulson, all internal communications related to them, and the personnel files of every officer who participated in those original investigations, including the IA detectives who interviewed you. We will also demand every body camera and dash camera recording from the last several years involving Coulson. Let's see them try to stonewall a federal subpoena." Avery felt a powerful surge of purpose. The frustration of the previous week, the sense of being a solitary victim fighting a monolithic system, dissolved. She was no longer just the victim. She was the tip of the spear. "David," she said, "the union is already spreading their narrative. They're going to frame this as a vindictive overreach." "Let them," Sterling said with a grim smile. "Let them scream to the press. Let them posture and threaten. They're bringing political knives to a surgical legal gunfight. While they're busy making noise, you will quietly and methodically build a case so airtight, so overwhelmingly documented, that by the time they realize what's happening, it will be too late." The video conference ended. Avery sat alone in the room for a moment, with the file still spread across the table in front of her. It was a map of one man's cruelty and a department's complicity. Now, it was also her battle plan. She began making the calls, assembling the team that would go to Northwood. The initial rumors of the investigation were about to become a roar. The blue wall had been built to withstand protests and lawsuits. It had never faced a siege of this magnitude. And Avery Taylor, the woman they had tried to break, was now leading the charge, armed with their own hidden secrets. Just as David Sterling had predicted, the moment the first wave of federal subpoenas hit the Northwood Police Department, the union responded not with compliance, but with open warfare. Stan Henderson, the union representative, understood he could not fight the Department of Justice on legal grounds, so he moved the battle to another arena: public opinion. He called a journalist he had on the payroll, a known attack blogger with an anti-government, pro-police stance named Bill Finney. Henderson fed him a carefully crafted narrative, a toxic cocktail of half-truths and outright lies. Lies designed to poison the well against Avery before the investigation could even gain traction. 4 hours later, the story broke. The headline was explosive. Exclusive. Department of Justice Vendetta against local hero cop. Led by corrupt, vindictive agent. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It portrayed Officer Coulson as a dedicated, decorated public servant, a family man unfairly targeted by a federal agency with a political agenda. The star of the piece, however, was Avery. Using anonymous sources inside the department, Finney painted her not as a victim, but as an arrogant, power-hungry bureaucrat. He wrote that she had been driving her million-dollar supercar recklessly, and that when Officer Coulson rightfully stopped her, she flew into a rage. The article claimed she had screamed at Coulson, "Do you know who I am?" and threatened to take his job. Her complaint, the article argued, was nothing more than the vengeful act of a privileged elitist who could not stand being treated like an ordinary citizen. The most venomous part of the article dug into her professional history. Finney had twisted her successful career at the Department of Justice into a sinister pattern. He mentioned 2 previous cases she had led against other police departments, presenting them not as successful prosecutions of corrupt officers, but as evidence of a deep-seated, obsessive anti-police bias. He called her the badge hunter, a federal agent who made her name destroying the lives of hardworking cops. The story spread like wildfire through the right-wing media ecosystem. It was picked up by cable news channels and shared thousands of times on social media by police support groups. The narrative was simple, blunt, and deeply divisive. A brave local cop versus a corrupt federal agent. Avery's name, which had been kept out of the initial reports, was now public. Her photograph was plastered next to Coulson's stoic departmental portrait. The effect was immediate and brutal. The conference room at the field office, once a secure center of investigation, now felt like a besieged bunker. Avery's phone began ringing with calls from unknown numbers, some leaving voicemails filled with biting, racist, and threatening messages. Her email inbox was flooded with hate. Online, anonymous trolls dissected her appearance, her career, and her race, while self-proclaimed patriots demanded her dismissal. Henderson and the Union had successfully weaponized public opinion. They had created enough smoke to hide the fire of Coulson's actual crimes. Local media, hungry for a conflict-driven story, began airing segments questioning the Department of Justice's motives. Was this a legitimate investigation or a politically motivated witch hunt? The public debate was no longer about a police officer forcing an unarmed woman to her knees at gunpoint. It was about the credibility of the woman herself. Inside the Department of Justice, the pressure began to mount. While Sterling and his immediate team supported her unconditionally, other officials in Washington worried about the public relations nightmare. Avery was summoned to a video conference with a deputy attorney general, a political appointee whose primary concern was managing public perception. "Dr. Taylor," the woman began in a soft, cautious voice, "this is becoming a media circus. Are you completely confident in the strength of your position? The optics are challenging. The optics are challenging because the opposition is engaged in a coordinated smear campaign," Avery replied in a cold, firm voice. "My position is grounded in evidence and facts, not in how a blogger chooses to present them. The man violated my civil rights and has a documented history of doing the same to others. That is the only perspective that should matter." She ended the call, feeling the immense weight of the machinery arrayed against her. They were no longer fighting only the Northwood Police Department. They were fighting a deeply entrenched cultural narrative, a powerful political lobby, and the insidious power of media manipulation. The Union's strategy was brilliant in its cynicism. They knew that if they could destroy her reputation, they could also destroy her case. They were putting the victim on trial, and for one terrifying moment, it seemed to be working. Sitting in the silence of the conference room, with the hate-filled headlines glowing on her laptop screen, Avery understood that this fight would require something more than evidence. It would require an iron will to withstand the fire of public condemnation, a fire that was being deliberately and expertly stoked to consume her. The smear campaign had breached the sterilized atmosphere of the investigation and infiltrated every corner of Avery's life. The pressure was no longer an external force. It was a constant, smothering atmosphere. When she entered the field office, she sensed a subtle shift in the air. While her core team remained fiercely loyal, some of the junior FBI agents assigned to the case looked at her with a flicker of doubt. They had grown up in a culture that revered law enforcement, and the union's narrative, false as it was, had planted uncertainty. Was she truly an impartial investigator? Or, as the blogs claimed, a woman with a personal vendetta? This internal skepticism was a quiet poison. During a strategy session, a young, ambitious attorney on her team questioned a line of inquiries. Are we sure that pursuing this angle doesn't feed the narrative that we're on a fishing expedition? He asked. The question was phrased professionally, but the subtext was clear. He was worried about the optics, how the opposition would spin their actions. Our job is not to manage their narrative, Avery declared. Her voice cut through the room, silencing all side conversations. Our job is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The truth does not bend to public relations. Let's be clear. Anyone on this team who is more concerned about Bill Finney's blog than the Constitution of the United States can be reassigned without questions. The challenge hung in the air, a direct confrontation with the growing doubt. No one moved. The point was made. But Avery knew the pressure was taking a toll. Outside the office, the situation was worse. The regional FBI director assigned her a permanent security detail. They drove her to and from the furnished apartment the Department of Justice had rented for her. Their presence was a constant reminder that the threats against her were considered credible. Paparazzi, a mix of traditional media and partisan bloggers, camped outside the building, shouting questions and taking photos every time she entered or left. Her anonymity was gone. Her life had become a public spectacle. The isolation was profound. She was hundreds of miles from her home, her friends, and her family. She spoke to her parents every night. Their voices were a mixture of pride and deep fear for her safety. She reassured them with a confidence she did not always feel. The articles had dragged every aspect of her life into the light, twisting her achievements into arrogance and her ambition into a character flaw. She was being judged not by her actions, but by the cartoon the union had created. One night, exhausted after a 16-hour day of reviewing documents and coordinating investigative teams, she sat in her silent apartment with the city lights glittering below. She scrolled through the news on her tablet, a form of self-inflicted torture she seemed unable to stop. She saw a clip from a cable news show. Stan Henderson, the union representative, was a guest, wearing an expression of feigned sincerity. "This isn't about justice," he told the camera. "This is about one disgruntled federal agent using the immense power of the United States government to settle a personal score. We're asking for a fair investigation, not a crusade led by someone who is clearly the primary complaining witness. It's a conflict of interest and a disgrace." His words were insidious, skillfully crafted to sound reasonable to an uninformed audience. He was using the very language of justice to defend injustice. Avery felt a surge of scorching fury, followed by a wave of deep exhaustion. This was a war of attrition. They were trying to wear her down, isolate her, make the personal cost of this investigation so high that she would collapse. She closed the tablet and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on her shoulders. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel its full force: the doubt of her colleagues, the hatred of strangers, the fear of her family, the relentless attacks on her integrity. They wanted her to quit. They wanted her to fail. They were betting that she was just a woman, and that a woman could be broken. As she looked at her reflection in the dark glass, she saw the fatigue in her eyes. But beneath it, she saw something else. A flash of the same cold, hard defiance she had felt kneeling on the asphalt. They had mistaken her composure for weakness, and her professionalism for a lack of resolve. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The pressure cooker was not breaking her. It was forging her. Every lie, every threat, every smear only hardened her determination. They believed they were putting her on trial. In reality, they were only fanning the flames of the woman who would serve as both judge and jury. The pressure was a crucible, and Avery Taylor was not going to melt. She was going to sharpen. Avery channeled the immense pressure into a singular, relentless focus. The smear campaign was pure propaganda. The ghost file provided by Sergeant Miller was the signal. It was her guide through the labyrinth of the Northwood Police Department's corruption, and she began to use it not as direct evidence, but as an intelligence report to guide every move of her team. "The file mentions a Juan Martinez," she said, during a morning briefing, pointing to a name from a complaint years earlier. Beaten by Coulson during a traffic stop. Complaint dismissed. The official file will show nothing. But Miller's notes indicate Martinez was treated at St. Michael's Urgent Care, and that his brother Carlos Martinez took photos of the injuries. Find them. The investigative process was meticulous. Her team, now unified by her unwavering leadership, fanned out across the city and beyond. They were digital ghosts scouring old databases, property records, and social media archives. 2 FBI investigators found Juan Martinez working a construction site in a neighboring state. He had left Northwood years earlier, trying to escape the memory of his humiliation. At first, he was terrified to speak with them. The fear of police retaliation was deeply ingrained. "They'll come for me," he said quietly, his eyes darting nervously. "They'll come for my family." The lead investigator, an experienced agent named Sarah Jenkins, who specialized in building trust with vulnerable witnesses, sat with him in his truck during his lunch break. "Juan," she said gently, "I understand your fear, but the people you're afraid of are the ones we're investigating. This is a federal civil rights case. Dr. Taylor, the woman in charge, had a gun pointed at her too. She was forced to her knees in the street just like you. She's not just an investigator. She's one of you." That was the turning point. Knowing that the person leading the case had suffered the same degradation created a bridge of shared experience. Juan's fear slowly gave way to a banked anger he had suppressed for more than a decade. He agreed to talk. His brother Carlos still had the photos on an old hard drive in his attic. The images were devastating. Juan's face was swollen, his left eye purple and nearly closed, a clear contradiction of the official report, claiming no injuries. This became the model. Using Miller's file, they identified and located other victims. Each had a story of abuse, and each story had been officially erased. There was Mrs. Gable, an elderly woman whose son, a passenger in a car Coulson had stopped, was dragged out and thrown to the ground for looking at him wrong. There was Marcus Thorne, a college student who was illegally searched and detained for hours because he fit a vague description, an experience that left him with overwhelming anxiety. Avery's team did not simply collect their stories. They reconstructed the cases the Northwood Police Department had deliberately dismantled. They found the former paramedics who had treated the victims on scene and whose initial reports had been rewritten. They located retired officers who, now free of the pressure of the blue wall, were willing to speak off the record about Coulson's reputation as a hothead. The most powerful connection they made was with the young man Sergeant Miller had mentioned, the same one Coulson had also forced to his knees at gunpoint years earlier. His name was Leo. Now in his 20s, the trauma of the event still haunted him. He had never told anyone except his parents. The department had threatened him with false charges if he ever filed a complaint. When Avery met with him in a quiet library conference room, she saw her own experience reflected in his haunted eyes. "I enjoyed it," Leo whispered, his hands trembling slightly. The look on his face. "He liked seeing me scared. He called me a thug and said this was his town." "I know that look, Leo," Avery said quietly. "I've seen it with my own eyes. And I promise you, his town is about to become federal jurisdiction. Your testimony, your story, is the most powerful weapon we have. It proves a pattern. It proves this was never about me. It was always about him." Piece by piece, they were building an irrefutable mosaic of abuse. Every new witness, every recovered document, every photograph was a dot. Avery and her team connected them, revealing the dark, hidden picture of Coulson's career. The union's media campaign was loud, but it was built on lies. Avery's case was being constructed through the quiet, painstaking work of uncovering buried truths. The noise would eventually fade. The evidence they were gathering would be permanent and enough to bring the entire wall down. With a growing arsenal of independently verified testimony and evidence, Avery intensified the legal pressure. The second wave of federal subpoenas was hand-delivered to the Northwood City Attorney's Office. These were no longer polite requests. They were strict demands backed by federal law. They demanded every internal email and text message that mentioned the name Avery Taylor. They demanded the complete, unedited body camera and dash camera recordings from Officer Coulson on the day of the incident. And most importantly, they demanded the lost or erased records corresponding to every complaint identified in their investigation. The city's initial response was to continue the stonewall. Their attorneys filed motions to quash the subpoenas, citing officer privacy, ongoing internal investigations, and a dozen other boilerplate legal arguments. But a federal judge reviewed the Department of Justice's preliminary report, hinting at a massive cover-up, and denied the city's motions within an hour. The order was simple: comply or face contempt charges, which could include fines and even jail time for city officials. Panic inside the Northwood Police Department was palpable. The blue wall, which had seemed so impenetrable, was beginning to crack under the relentless federal pressure. They could no longer hide behind procedural delays. Their next move was a classic tactic of corrupt departments: malicious compliance mixed with obstruction. They produced thousands of pages of documents, but they were deliberately disorganized, with key pages missing. They provided email chains that were obviously incomplete. And then came the most critical evidence: the body camera footage. The city attorney's office sent a formal letter to the Department of Justice. It stated that while the city was willing to cooperate, the body camera footage from Officer Coulson on the day of the stop had been irretrievably corrupted due to a data transfer error. They claimed the dash camera footage from his car had been overwritten by a system failure before it could be downloaded. It was a lie so brazen and so blatant that it was almost ridiculous in the digital age. To claim that two independent recording systems failed simultaneously on the exact same incident under federal investigation was an admission of guilt. In the Department of Justice Command Center, Avery read the letter with a cold smile. "They're no longer obstructing justice," she told her team. "They're creating evidence for us. This is the act of a guilty party trying to destroy the proof of their crime." She immediately dispatched a team of FBI forensic experts with a new court order. This one to seize the physical hardware, the body camera, the hard drives from the patrol cars, and the central servers at the station. The Northwood Police Department was forced to watch as federal agents methodically cataloged and removed their equipment. While the forensic team worked on recovering the corrupted data, Avery's investigators leveraged the department's obstruction. They brought several officers who had been on the periphery of Coulson's complaints face to face with the reality of a federal criminal investigation for obstruction and the certainty that lying to an FBI agent was a felony. Their loyalty to the blue wall began to waver. One IT officer, confronted with the warrant and warned about the penalties for perjury, finally broke. He admitted under oath that the police chief himself had ordered him to handle Coulson's recordings. He had not permanently deleted them. He had simply moved them to a hidden, partitioned section of the server, hoping they would go unnoticed. He provided the federal agents with the access credentials. Within hours they had them. The unedited body camera footage from Coulson. Avery and her core team gathered in the conference room to watch. The video was crystal clear. It showed everything exactly as she remembered it, but with a visceral, stomach-turning reality. It showed her calm. It showed Coulson's escalating, unprovoked aggression. It captured his mocking, racist question, "Where does someone like you get that kind of money?" It showed her open, steady hands as she retrieved her documents. There was no furtive movement. And then came the climax. The recording clearly showed Coulson drawing his Glock and screaming, "On your knees," at an unarmed, compliant citizen. It captured the absolute ugliness of his abuse of power. The audio was perfect, his voice a venomous growl, hers calm and firm. It was the irrefutable proof. It not only proved her case, the department's attempt to hide it added a new explosive charge to their growing list of crimes. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. Avery leaned back in her chair as the video ended. The screen froze on the image of her kneeling on the asphalt, seen from the perspective of the man holding the gun. The stone wall had not merely collapsed. The Northwood Police Department had handed her the dynamite she needed to blow it wide open. They had overplayed their hand. And now the path to a grand jury was clear. The convening of a federal grand jury is a solemn, secret process, a proceeding in which the government presents its evidence to a panel of ordinary citizens to determine whether there is probable cause to issue a formal indictment. For Avery and her team, it was the moment when their months of relentless, meticulous investigation would be put to the test. They were not yet taking the case to trial. They were arguing that a trial was necessary. The proceedings took place in a secure room inside the federal courthouse. No judge, no defense attorneys. Only the prosecutors, the witnesses, and the 16 members of the grand jury. Avery, in her role as lead investigator, worked with the assistant U.S. attorney to orchestrate the presentation of evidence. They began by establishing the pattern. One by one, Mark Coulson's other victims were called to testify. Juan Martinez, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, recounted the beating he had suffered years earlier. The prosecutors displayed the photographs his brother had taken, enlarged on a giant screen. The brutal injuries were a clear testament to the violence he had endured. Marcus Thorne described the lasting psychological trauma of being illegally detained and harassed as a college student. Mrs. Gable spoke with the quiet dignity of a mother whose son had been needlessly mistreated. Their testimony painted a portrait of Coulson's contempt for the community he had sworn to protect. The testimony that silenced the room was Leo's. The young man, now backed by the full weight of the Department of Justice, spoke of being forced to his knees at gunpoint. His account was a chilling echo of Avery's own experience. As he spoke, the faces of the jurors hardened. They were no longer seeing isolated incidents. They were seeing a clear pattern of predatory behavior, a consistent signature of humiliation and abuse. To corroborate these stories, the prosecution presented the hard-won evidence. They showed the sanitized official reports alongside the contradictory original medical documents. They played the erased dispatch audio in which Coulson could be heard using racial slurs. Each piece of evidence was a brick, and they were building a fortress of probable cause. The most dramatic moment came with an anonymous witness who testified from behind a screen with a digitally altered voice. He could not reveal his identity, but he could testify about the system that had protected Coulson for so long. He described the unofficial policy of burying complaints against favored officers. He explained how reports would go missing, how witnesses would be intimidated, and how the union would step in to smother any legitimate investigation. He spoke of a culture where loyalty was valued above the law, and where an officer like Coulson was not seen as a liability, but as an enforcer of an unspoken code for the department. Miller's disguised voice filled the silent room. Coulson wasn't a problem officer. He was a perfect soldier. Finally, the prosecution presented the evidence of the cover-up in Avery's case. They played the unedited body camera footage. The grand jurors watched in absolute, horrified silence as the events unfolded on the screen. They saw Coulson mock her. They heard his illegal orders. They watched him point his weapon at an unarmed woman without any justification. Then the assistant U.S. attorney presented the testimony of the IT officer who had hidden the recordings on the chief's orders. He showed the emails and internal communications demanding the destruction of evidence. This was the final, devastating blow. It elevated the case from the brutality of a single officer to a criminal conspiracy involving the highest levels of the police department. This was no longer only about what Nathaniel Coulson had done to Avery Taylor and the others. It was about what the entire department had done to the rule of law. Avery did not testify. It was a strategic decision. The focus had to remain on the overwhelming weight of the evidence, not on the personal story of one federal agent. Her role was behind the scenes, ensuring that every piece of the puzzle was presented with impeccable, irrefutable clarity. After 3 days of testimony and evidence, the presentation concluded. The grand jury retired to deliberate. Avery and the prosecution team waited in a nearby office, in a silence thick with anticipation. They had presented a mountain of evidence. Now it was in the hands of the jurors. Less than 2 hours later, they received the summons. The grand jury had reached a decision. The 4 members handed the signed document to the U.S. attorney. It was what they had worked for. It was what the victims had waited years to see. It was real law, a decision to indict. The case would go to trial. The indictment was unsealed the following morning and landed on the city of Northwood like a bomb. The news first appeared on the federal court websites and then exploded across local and national media. This was not a single charge. It was a multi-count formal accusation that exposed the depth of the corruption. The first count was deprivation of rights under color of law for the illegal stop, search, and excessive use of force against Dr. Avery Taylor. Counts 2 through 5 were 4 additional charges of deprivation of rights, one for each of the other victims who had testified before the grand jury. Juan Martinez, Marcus Thorne, Leo, and Mrs. Gable's son. Count 6 was obstruction of a federal investigation for his role in concealing the body camera footage. Count 7 was conspiracy to obstruct justice, a charge that also named the Northwood police chief as an unindicted co-conspirator, signaling the likelihood of further arrests. The news stunned the community. For years, rumors of brutality by the Northwood Police Department had circulated in minority communities, dismissed by those in power as unfounded complaints. Now those rumors were confirmed on the front page of every newspaper, detailed in the cold, formal language of a federal indictment. Officer Nathaniel Colson was arrested at his home at dawn by a team of FBI agents. There was no swagger, no bluster. The photographs taken by the news crews showed a man in a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, pale and shattered by shock, as he was led away in handcuffs. The mirrored sunglasses were gone, revealing the tired, fearful eyes of a bully who had finally met a power he could not intimidate. The police chief was suspended, and the city council announced the launch of an independent investigation, a desperate political move to distance itself from the scandal. Stan Henderson, the union representative, held a furious press conference on the courthouse steps. He railed against federal overreach and the politically motivated witch hunt. But his words, which had once seemed so forceful, now rang hollow and desperate. The mountain of evidence detailed in the indictment had shattered his narrative. He was no longer defending a hero cop. He was defending a man credibly accused of being a serial abuser and a criminal conspirator. For Avery, the indictment was a crucial victory, but she knew it was only the beginning of the final battle. The real fight would be in the courtroom. She and her team worked tirelessly preparing for trial. They reviewed every testimony, stress-tested every piece of evidence, and anticipated every possible defense move. The public reaction was a radical shift. Media outlets that had previously given credence to the union's smear campaign now published exhaustive investigative pieces on the history of the Northwood Police Department. The victims, once voiceless, were now hailed as brave heroes for speaking out. Support for Avery poured in from across the country. Civil rights organizations praised the Department of Justice's actions, and legal experts lauded the thoroughness of the investigation. The cartoon of the badge hunter had been replaced by the reality of a determined, principled investigator, committed to justice. Inside the Northwood Police Department, the blue wall had completely collapsed. Faced with the conspiracy charge and the threat of a federal process, officers began to talk. Many came to the Department of Justice offering testimony against Colson and the department's leadership in exchange for immunity. The trickle of information became a flood, providing Avery's team with even more evidence to use at trial. Sergeant Harlan Miller watched the news from his home with a quiet sense of vindication. The secret he had kept for so long was now public knowledge, and the system he had been unable to change from within was finally being exposed. He had received a discreet encrypted message from Avery's office. "Thank you. Your courage made this possible. You are safe." The indictment was not merely a legal document. It was a symbol. It was a declaration that no badge was a shield against accountability, that no wall was high enough to hide the truth from a determined investigation. The stage was set for the final act. Colson had entered a plea of not guilty, and his defense team, funded by the union, was preparing for battle. They had one last desperate card to play, and Avery knew they would wait until trial to reveal it. The trial began 6 months later, a media spectacle that drew reporters from across the country. The federal courtroom was packed every day. On one side sat the prosecution team, led by a sharp assistant U.S. attorney, with Avery seated just behind him, a constant serene presence at the counsel table. On the other side sat Nathaniel Coulson, looking diminished in a cheap suit, flanked by a team of high-priced defense attorneys paid by the police union. The prosecution built its case methodically, just as it had before the grand jury. One by one, the victims took the stand. Juan, Leo, Marcus, and the others told their stories to the jury. Their voices, once silenced by fear, were now clear and steady. Their testimony was emotional, moving, and devastatingly consistent. They vividly portrayed a police officer who used his authority not to protect, but to terrorize. Sergeant Miller testified again, his identity still protected, his voice disguised, lending a chilling authenticity to his account of the department's systemic corruption. The prosecution presented a mountain of corroborating evidence: the medical records, the missing files, the damning dispatch audio. They proved the conspiracy to obstruct justice through the IT officer, who detailed how he had been ordered to hide the body camera footage. Throughout the process, Coulson's defense remained passive, barely cross-examining the victims, knowing they could not refute their credible accounts. To observers in the courtroom, it appeared they had no defense, that they were simply going through the motions before an inevitable guilty verdict. But Avery knew better. They were waiting. They were holding back for the perfect moment to deploy their final, desperate tactic. That moment arrived when the prosecution rested its case. Coulson's lead attorney, a shrewd, media-savvy lawyer named Robert Davis, rose to address the court. "Your Honor," he announced with a confident flourish, "the defense calls its first and only witness, our digital media expert. And we would like to introduce an exhibit, the body camera recording of the incident involving Dr. Taylor." A murmur swept the courtroom. The prosecution had already shown the recording. What could the defense hope to achieve by showing it again? "The prosecution has shown you their version of this video," Davis told the jury with theatrical sincerity, but they conveniently omitted the most crucial part, the part that shows what really happened. They want you to believe Officer Coulson was the aggressor. We are about to show you that he was in fact reacting to a direct verbal threat from Dr. Taylor herself. Davis's expert took the stand and began playing the video on the large screens in the courtroom. It started the same way, Coulson approaching Avery's car. But the audio was different. It was choppy, with a strange low hum. Then came the moment Avery stepped out of the car. In this version, her voice suddenly became loud, distorted, and aggressive. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," the voice on the video snarled. "I'll take your badge for this. I'll destroy you." The courtroom gasped. The jury looked stunned, staring from the screen to a shocked Avery. And back to the screen. In this version, Coulson's act of drawing his weapon seemed almost reasonable, a reaction to a direct, credible threat. The video ended shortly after. "As you can see," Davis said, turning to the jury with a triumphant smile, "Dr. Taylor was not a calm, compliant victim. She was an aggressor who used her federal position to threaten a police officer. Officer Coulson acted to neutralize a perceived threat, exactly as he was trained to do. The Department of Justice has been hiding this truth from you from the beginning. The tactic was as brilliant as it was perverse. They did not deny the existence of the video. They altered it. They took the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence and twisted it into a weapon against their primary witness. They were betting that the subtle distortion would go unnoticed, that the jury would be swayed by the shocking audio, and that the entire case would collapse under the weight of this new revelation. The prosecutor shot to his feet, objecting furiously, but the damage was done. The jury was confused. Their confidence in the prosecution's version was shaken. Avery looked at Coulson for the first time since his arrest. There was a spark of hope in his eyes, a blind faith that he might still walk away. Avery leaned forward and whispered to the assistant U.S. attorney. "They just lost the trial." The attorney looked at her, puzzled. "They think we're fools," she continued with a cold, certain look. "They have no idea what our forensic team can do. Call our rebuttal witness right now." The defense had played its last card, but they had vastly underestimated the hand Avery was holding. The courtroom was thick with tension the next morning. The defense's altered video had thrown the proceedings into chaos, and the faces of the jurors reflected a mixture of confusion and suspicion. Robert Davis, Coulson's attorney, looked satisfied, believing he had delivered a fatal blow. He did not know the prosecution had a first-class rebuttal waiting. "The prosecution calls Dr. Elena Petrova," the assistant U.S. attorney announced. A sharp-eyed, intelligent woman, with an air of unshakable confidence, took the oath. She was introduced as the head of the FBI's Digital Forensic Laboratory at Quantico, one of the world's foremost experts in video and audio authentication. The prosecutor began his examination. "Dr. Petrova, have you had the opportunity to analyze the video file presented yesterday by the defense?" "Yes," she confirmed in a clear, precise voice. "And what were your findings?" "My findings were conclusive," Dr. Petrova stated, looking directly at the jury. "The video file presented by the defense is a deliberate and amateurish fabrication." A wave of murmurs swept the courtroom. Davis shot to his feet. "Objection!" "Overruled," the judge snapped. "The witness is a qualified expert. Let her testify." Dr. Petrova continued in the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. "The defense expert claimed this was the complete video. It is not. The file has been truncated. It ends abruptly before Officer Coulson forces Dr. Taylor to her knees. But the more significant problem is the audio track." She turned to the large screen. "May I?" The prosecutor nodded. "Please, doctor, show the jury what you found." "Audio data, like video, leaves a digital fingerprint," Dr. Petrova explained, as a complex waveform graph appeared on the screen. "Every recording has a unique noise profile, a kind of ambient signature. In the original, unedited body camera recording, this profile is consistent throughout." She played a brief segment of the authentic audio, and a stable, clean waveform was highlighted. "Now," she said, "this is the waveform of the audio presented by the defense." A new graph appeared. It was irregular, inconsistent, and showed a clear, sharp spike. Exactly at the moment Dr. Taylor supposedly issues her threat, we see a digital splice. The background noise profile changes completely. Someone has cut in a new audio segment. She isolated the vocal track. Furthermore, we analyzed the alleged threat using a vocal spectrograph. A new color graph appeared, mapping the frequencies of the voice. The voice delivering the threat does not match the vocal fingerprint of Dr. Taylor, which we obtained from the rest of the authentic recording. It is someone else. The pitch and timbre have been digitally manipulated to sound similar, but the underlying print is unequivocally different. The jurors were leaning forward, captivated. Davis's face had gone pale. "But it gets worse," Dr. Petrova said, her voice cold. "The words, 'destroy you' or 'I'll take' were not even spoken in that sequence. They were assembled syllable by syllable, likely extracted from different parts of unrelated recordings. It is a digital ransom note." Then she delivered the final devastating blow. However, the most conclusive evidence of manipulation is found in the metadata of the file itself. She displayed a screen full of code. Every digital file contains hidden data about its own history. The metadata of the defense's video file shows that it was opened and edited with a commercial video editing program 2 weeks ago on a computer registered to the headquarters of the Northwood Police Union. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the explosion of truth was too powerful to contain. The defense had not merely presented fabricated evidence. The prosecution's expert had traced the forgery directly back to Coulson's own supporters. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance and stupidity. "I have one final thing to show the court," the assistant U.S. attorney said, his voice filled with righteous fury. He turned to the clerk. "Please play Government Exhibit 177B, the complete, unedited, and authenticated body camera recording from Officer Coulson." The original video played again. The jury watched it with new eyes. Confusion transformed into disgust. They heard Coulson's true words. They saw his true actions. They saw the unprovoked aggression, the racist undercurrent, and the blatant abuse of power. They watched him point his weapon at an unarmed woman and scream, "On your knees!" The recording continued past where the defense version had stopped, showing Avery slowly, painfully lowering herself onto the gravelly asphalt. The digital evidence had not only exonerated Avery, it had incinerated Coulson's last hope and exposed the depth of his corruption and that of his allies. The trial was effectively over. Only the verdict remained. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The brazen act of presenting falsified evidence in a federal courtroom had erased any lingering doubt and solidified their decision. When they returned to the jury box, their faces showed a grim, resolute expression. The court clerk took the verdict form from the judge. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence. "On the first count, deprivation of rights against Dr. Avery Taylor, how do you find?" "Guilty," the foreperson answered in a firm voice. "On counts 2 through 5, deprivation of rights, how do you find?" "Guilty on all counts," the litany continued. "Guilty of obstruction. Guilty of conspiracy." With each pronouncement, Nathaniel Coulson seemed to shrink in his chair. The verdict was total, an absolute and complete repudiation of his actions and his lies. When the final guilty verdict was read, he slumped forward, his face ashen. His attorney, Robert Davis, stared straight ahead with a vacant expression, his career likely ruined by his participation in the evidence tampering scheme. Sentencing was held a month later. The federal judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman, known for her devotion to the rule of law, looked down at Coulson from the bench. "Mr. Coulson," she began in a voice devoid of compassion, "you swore an oath to uphold the law. Instead, you became its predator. You targeted citizens based on the color of their skin and the price of their car. You terrorized them. You humiliated them. You assaulted them. And then, you used your badge as a shield to hide your crimes. Your actions are a stain on every honorable officer who serves with integrity," she continued, raising her voice with controlled anger. "But your crimes did not end there. When you were caught, you showed no remorse. You participated in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. You and your allies attempted to destroy the reputation of a dedicated public servant and, most vile of all, you fabricated evidence and presented it in this very courtroom. That was not merely an attack on Dr. Taylor. It was an attack on the very foundations of our judicial system. This court will not tolerate such contempt." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "For the crimes of depriving citizens of their constitutional rights, for obstructing a federal investigation, and for your conspiracy against the justice system of the United States, this court sentences you to a term of imprisonment." She looked him directly in the eyes. The guidelines suggest a range. However, given the profound and repeated violation of the public trust, this court sentences you to 6 years and 4 months in federal prison. The sentence was precise, a clear message that every day had been accounted for. A gasp of astonishment swept the courtroom. It was a significant sentence, far greater than Coulson had ever expected. As the U.S. Marshals approached to take him into custody, he looked at Avery. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a serene, solemn determination. He had been so blinded by his own intolerance that he had picked a fight with the one person who had the power, the skill, and the unbreakable will to see it all the way through. As Coulson was led away in handcuffs, beginning his journey to federal prison, Avery stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by the victims who had bravely testified. The press surged forward, a chaotic sea of cameras and microphones. Avery stepped to the podium, not as a victim, but as a reformer. "Today's verdict is not a cause for celebration," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It is a moment of solemn accountability. It sends a clear message. No one is above the law. But justice for these victims is not enough. We must ensure there are no future victims." She then announced the next phase of the Department of Justice's work. Effective immediately, the Department of Justice is imposing a consent decree on the Northwood Police Department. This legally binding agreement will require radical reforms in training, supervision, and community relations. There will be a federally appointed monitor to ensure compliance. The culture of corruption that protected Nathaniel Coulson for years ends today. This is a new dawn for the city. The verdict delivered justice. The consent decree promised change. Avery's ordeal, which had begun with a moment of profound humiliation on the side of a road, had culminated in the complete dismantling of a corrupt institution. Later that night, Avery stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city lights. The noise of the trial had ceased. The cameras were gone. A deep silence had settled over her. She thought about the journey, the searing heat of the asphalt on her knees, the cold fury that had sustained her, the faces of the other victims who had found their voices. This had never been only about one man. It had been about the insidious nature of power when exercised without accountability. It had been about the quiet courage of a single sergeant who chose conscience over conformity, and the collective strength of victims who refused to remain silenced any longer. Her victory did not reside in Coulson's prison sentence. It resided in the promise of the consent decree, in the structural changes that would protect countless people. She had faced the worst of a broken system and forced it to yield, if only a little, to justice. It had been a hard, exhausting, and necessary fight. The scars of her humiliation would remain, not as marks of shame, but as reminders of the price of vigilance and the profound strength required to transform personal pain into common good. The battle was won. But she knew the struggle for true equality was far from over. What do you consider the most powerful moment in Avery's journey toward justice? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's courage truly made a difference? Share your thoughts in the comments.